Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Classic Rock and Prog Almanac with me, Tim Appleton, today. All on me, Todd. There's a play by Alan Bennett, who's one of Britain's finest wits, called The History Boys. And it's about a group of young lads, I think working class lads, in Sheffield, training to go to Cambridge or Oxford to study history, right? This is a comedy. And it deals with sort of, I suppose, sort of passage of life type issues. It's got great lines in it. What's your definition of history? One fucking thing after another. So things like that. One of the issues that comes up in that is the question of counterfactual history, or what they call history in the subjunctive, as in, hypothetical history. And we're going to do a bit of that today. One of the themes here for me, is the question of why bands break up. Yeah, because they're like little gangs, aren't they, bands? Usually boys. That's why traditionally they don't have many girls in them. There's not many gangs of boys, traditionally include girls. Anyway, there's lots of examples of famous band breakups. And I think one of the most interesting dialectical intra-band relationships is that of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, or Crosby, Stills and Nash if you prefer. Crosby, Stills and Nash plus Young. Now the first Crosby, Stills and Nash album, i.e. before Young joined, is a stone cold classic from the 60s. You got Stephen Stills there from Buffalo Springfield, David Crosby from the Byrds, Graham Nash from the Hollies, of course, the British band the Hollies. A strange combination, possibly, but it seemed to work, and the combination of voices was awesome, and the songwriting was so good on that first album. I think it's one of the greatest albums of the 60s. Is it defining of the California sound? Possibly, again. Does the California sound exist? What is it? Who knows? It's like the Canterbury scene. Does it exist? Yeah, who knows? Does it exist? Possibly. So, after the first album came out, Crosby, Stills and Nash invited Neil Young to join, I believe at the behest of Arma Ertegun from Atlantic Records. I'm not really sure whether that was a good idea or not. He seemed a bit like an agent of chaos, Neil Young. And after they produced one more record, they broke up. I'm not sure. Did Neil Young want to be there? I don't know. He was always a free agent, wasn't he? He'd been in Buffalo Springfield, of course, with Stephen Stills. Another one of the great American bands of the 60s, let's say North American, because Neil Young's Canadian, isn't he? After that first album, they became CSNY rather than just CSN. And that second album was called Deja-Vu, 1970. Another total classic, we recently discovered, or was it just me, that this album, the second album, was a product of a lengthy, complex, but quite productive set of sessions that produced a huge number of songs. I discovered this, when I heard the deluxe edition of Deja-Vu, which came out, I think, last year. Some of these sort of outtake songs are great. Most of them are not, actually, but there is some real gems in there. Apparently, it was originally supposed to be a double album, and of course, in the end, it was just a single. I think that was probably wise because, as I say, some of this material is fairly below par. Although, as I say, not all of it. I think part of the problem is that Stephen Stills didn't quite seem to be at his most fertile during this period. That happened a little bit earlier on, and then later on. We'll come back to that. Nevertheless, second CSN album, CSNY, as it were. Great entry in the history of rock. Now, I think that at this point in the career, you feel that 2 albums in, this band are really going places. And might even sort of reorientate the story of rock. It's one of those great what-ifs. Because they played Woodstock and seemed to have the wind at their backs. However, they suddenly decide to disband. and make 4 solo albums instead of another band album. Now, and for all intents and purposes, they didn't reform after that. They did a couple of albums together much later on when they were well past their best, so it didn't really matter anymore. And CSN reformed a few times and put out some albums, the first of which isn't too bad, subsequent ones of which are not that interesting, although they have some good moments, I think. But really, the subsequent incarnations of either band, as I hope I've made clear, are sort of involve rather subpar efforts at albums, right? They did do some live work together. Maybe come back to that. Perhaps we should add that they tried to get together to do a follow-up to Deja-Vu around 1974. I think it was supposed to be called Human Highway, and there's even a provisional track list for that that's been circulated. It looks like it could have been okay, that album, could have been all right. Perhaps not quite at the level of the early stuff, depending, I think, on exactly when it was going to come out and exactly what it was going to include, right? Because there were some really great tracks floating around at that time, but I'm not sure whether some of them would have qualified for that album if it had come out in 74, as it was originally mooted to do. But still, pretty good stuff on that album. On that hypothetical album. This band tended to work in subunits. I think it's necessary to point that out. And I think they just used to describe CSNY as the mothership, right? In that sense. So, they would kind of like separate out into individual projects, joint projects, and then come back together potentially at certain points, certainly for live work, not necessarily for studio albums, as I've already pointed out. So, for example, Crosby and Nash did a few albums together, which, again, have some pretty good moments. Plus, Wind on the Water, which came out, can't quite remember when, 75, was it 76? That album's pretty much a masterpiece. I think it's 75, actually. And it's probably the best album, I think, that any of them did outside the mothership, as it were. And STILLS Young made an album together in the aftermath of the abandonment of Human Highway, the 74, potential reunion album. And I think that's because they were apparently the only two left after Crosby and Nash recorded some backup vocals, I believe on a Stephen Stills track, that he hated so much that he actually destroyed the tapes. I think he cut them up with scissors. Can't quite remember the story, but something like that. And, faced with this kind of professional sabotage, a lot of this band's behaviour towards each other, it has to be said, it was quite babyish, as I suppose is the norm in gangs, of young men. But anyway. After that sort of event, what could Crosby and Nash do other than walk out? Graham Nash apparently burst into tears. Sensitive soul. Anyway, back to the 4 solo albums released after Deja-Vu. The thought experiment I want to engage in today is as follows. What if, instead of disbanding and creating 4 slightly lackluster solo albums, for they are slightly lackluster, I think each of them in their own, each of them in their own way is quite lackluster. I'll explain that as I go on. What if, instead of doing that, they'd managed to stay in one room long enough to pull their best tracks and put out another band album, right? So that's the thought experiment. I even thought we could perhaps call it Back to the Mothership, if that is indeed what they called the band itself. Now, my initial thought is that if this had happened, it would have been possibly not only the best album of their career to date, it might have been one of the greatest rock albums of all time. Of course, this is all speculative, but, it is fun to speculate. And the fact that they didn't do that, I think, is kind of unforgivable is not the word, but inexplicable might be a better word. Sorry, little drinky poos there. And I suppose it's easy to get angry at them for not sticking together. But, I suppose today, following the invention of Spotify playlists, we can transport ourselves back to that moment. But what would it have looked like? Well, that's what we're getting to now. First of all, what are the 4 albums we have to choose from, and will this exhaust our research? Well, the albums are STILLS by STILLS, imaginative title that. If I Could Only Remember My Name by David Crosby, Songs for Beginners by Graham Nash, and After the Gold Rush by Neil Young. Now, of these, my favourite is, drum roll please, Songs for Beginners by Graham Nash. It's weird that, isn't it? Because you would almost expect me to say Neil Young, because everyone loves Neil Young. And after this, he made Harvest, of course, which was big hit. But personally, I've never been a big fan of After the Gold Rush. Apologies to After the Gold Rush fans. It wasn't actually his first album, of course. It was his second album. But yeah, it's never quite convinced me, this one. I mean, I think the fairly acceptable reason that I don't like the songs on it that much. I do love Harvest and some of his other 70s albums, particularly Time Fades Away, I love. On the Beach, I think, is really good. And I should add, perhaps, to this list, the, at the time, unreleased, but since released, Homegrown and Hitchhiker, which is my favourite album by Neil Young of all time. But I think around the time of After the Gold Rush, he wasn't in his most productive phase, or specifically when he was doing that album, I think. You might have expected me to choose STILLS' first album as the greatest, if not Neil Young. Apparently, it was very well received at the time. Plus, STILLS, we'll have to go on a little diversion here, was probably considered the leader of Crosby, Stills and Nash, the most productive and the most original songwriter, and, personality-wise. But I think he went on and off a bit. Not long after this, he put together a completely new band, Manassas, 72, I think. Actually, this might have been the nail in the coffin of the first incarnation of CSNY. Now, Manassas was sort of just him and his mates, really. Had Chris Hillman from the Byrds in it. He was probably the most sort of famed other member. Manassas made 2 albums, and the first is a double, and it's a bit of a classic. It even includes a suite on side 1, which is really nice. That first album is great. There's about 6 people in that band, even more if you count the studio stuff, which apparently included Bill Wyman, from the bass player from the Stones, who was rumoured to be considering leaving the Stones to join Manassas. Don't think that would have been a good career move, because they only lasted for one more poorly received single album. But the point is that of all the people involved in that project, it was STILLS that more or less wrote everything there. So that's quite impressive, especially considering that the first Manassas album was a double, So that first Manassas album, which is really great, by the way, is kind of a return to form for STILLS. Because he did 2 solo albums before it, I think, and neither of them is that great for my money. Although some of it is eminently salvageable, as you're about to find out. STILLS' first solo album is not my favourite. What about David Crosby? Well, his album is generally like a sort of stoner record, I think. It's perhaps the best word to describe it. There's a famous quote from the Gettysburg Address, right, by Abraham Lincoln. Is it government by the people, of the people, for the people? Something like that. So perhaps we could say that this is an album, David Crosby's first album is an album by, for and of stoners. Not too much fun otherwise. It's one of those albums that you feel like, I might be enjoying this more if I were on drugs. Critics seem to love it. And I think it's got a nice vibe. I suppose that's the best I can say about it. He often seems like he transmits good vibes, David Crosby, I think, to his listeners and friends. But yeah, the albums sort of also pay into hippie philosophy, music is love, etc. He was very peace and love, wasn't David Crosby? I don't know if he had that in mind when he was later done for armed robbery, but anyway, let's not speak ill of the dead, because we lost him, didn't we, last year? Poor lovely David Crosby. Anyway, but yeah, again, as I say, like if you consider what he'd done before, particularly with Crosby, Stills and Nash, because Crosby's contribution to the first Crosby, Stills and Nash album is his contributions are amazing, but this doesn't really match up, I think. In a second, you'll see what songs I'm rescuing from all these efforts. Yeah, as I say, my favourite of these is Graham Nash's Songs for Beginners, because I think it just has the most good songs on it. And as I say, that's going to be reflected in the lineup of the hypothetical, history in the subjunctive version of CSNY2 that I'm about to back to the mothership, which I'm about to propose. I think we also should take into account perhaps a couple of band outtakes that were subsequently released, outtakes from Deja-Vu and from the first album, and also what else? I sort of included in my sweep offcuts from the early sessions and some demos, but actually I don't think I included any of them in the end. I don't think I found any of them worth including in the end, because better stuff comes out generally on the solo albums, and in that sense, like with Stephen Stills, for example, I'm focusing basically just on the solo album. But what else? Yeah, and there's a contemporary single involved, which I'll explain. I'll explain that reference in a minute. Okay, so let's get into it. Once again, I'm doing LPs here. Screw CDs. I've tried to pack the album to the gills, right? I don't think it was obligatory in the US at that time to do long albums, but I think you can do long albums, I'm never completely 100% sure on that, what the technical limitations of, like, placing grooves on the side of an LP are, but anyway, maybe someone else can enlighten us on that subject. Also, whilst others might agree, final caveat, whilst others might agree with the tracks I've chosen to include, they might have put them in a different order. But anyway, this is what I've sketched. So, side 1, which I believe is about 22 minutes, comes out about 22 minutes, begins with Love the One You're With, right? It's a fairly obvious choice, this one. It's track 1 on Stephen Stills' first solo album. I would say this is one of the greatest songs of all time from the Mothership, right? Effortlessly brilliant. Extremely simple, but completely beautiful. And the band seem to really love this song as well. They started all of their concerts with it, it's particularly on the famous Megabucks 1974 tour. Because, as I said before, even though they didn't make another album together in the early period, they did go on tour together after a few years. Now, the arrangement in the live version is completely different. It's a sort of funky, slow 4, full band arrangement. It's sort of classical rock and roll band arrangement, I suppose. Because the original doesn't have drums as such, the Stephen Stills version. It's percussive and sort of played, as it were, at double speed in comparison to the live version. It's almost like a ragtime piece, this. But I think coupled with very fast Caribbean-type percussion, specifically, I think steel pan, right, which was from Trinidad and Tobago. Stills' work is very multicultural. It always was. He's always mixing in sounds from what today is, I think, rather dubiously called the Global South. He was influenced by Latin music. I think he spent time in South America as a child. The first track on the first album by Crosby, Stills and Nash, it contains him actually singing in Spanish, I believe. And yes, as I say, it's got steel pan on it. Love the One You're With. Also sounds quite gospel-y. So, I mean, there's a real short circuit between different, not just different styles, but different cultures and different countries, different parts of the world, right? That seems to have been more or less intentional. Luther Vandross later did a pretty epic version of this track. in a sense, what Van Dross does is he synthesizes the two approaches, the CSNY live one and the Stephen Stills original, because it's kind of a mixture of gospel and mid-tempo rock, the Luther Vandross version. But anyway, as I say, brilliant track, this one. Wonderful opener. I like the lyric as well. I think it's philosophically sophisticated, plus funny. So, yeah, I mean, that's a dream combination for me. Philosophical and funny. It's got this sort of Voltaire line in it, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, which I think is, philosophically a very interesting observation. Apparently, Stills learnt that line from Billy Preston, who was, an avid reader of Voltaire. I don't know. Also, Billy Preston always seems to have been present when anything important was happening in the 60s or the 70s. I think there's a film coming out about him, actually. So look out for that. Now, the other thing here on this track is I think that this perfectly brilliant song might as well be a CSNY track because they're all playing on it, or at least singing. I mean, specifically, Crosby and Nash are singing. Neil Young was no doubt off recording his another solo album somewhere. It total individualist, isn't he, Neil Young? I mean, it makes me laugh, sometimes his level of absolute indifference to this whole project. I've no idea why they bothered including him really at this point. But anyway, as we said, it could have been record company pressure. Also, you've got Calvin Samuel playing bass here, who otherwise played bass with CSNY and Manassas as well. I think that so like, as I say, it's got some real like Crosby, Stills and Nash type vocal flourishes here, and sort of riffs as well. I mean, the wordless insert at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. I mean, it sounds so much like "Sweet Judy Blue Eyes," which is the first track from the first CSN album, that it reminds us that really this would have been a worthy follow-up. I mean, "Sweet Judy Blue Eyes" is the paradigm CSN track, I think. It's sort of, as they say, it's a medley, and written for Judy Collins, who had blue eyes, right? It's a rather literalist approach from our Stephen there, but anyway, no mind. But yeah, in other words, this is a slam dunk for a CSNY2 song, this one. Now, track 2, I'm going with "Do for the Others." Now, I'm actually following here the opening of Stephen Stills' first solo album, because this one is the second track on that album, right? And it's a lovely flow between these first and second two tracks. And of course, as I say, his solo album is I mean, you can deduce that I really love his solo album up to this point. But after that, I think it drops off, and I don't use any more of it. So sorry about that for fans of that first album. But yeah, now this song, "Do for the Others," was actually an outtake from the first Crosby, Stills and Nash album. It's so good, it could have gone on that album, actually. But again, they had an abundance of good material for that album. So probably wasn't necessary. But lovely little ballad, this one. Lovely little folky ballad. I think it's, in that sense, it's an appropriate second moment on this mooted fantasy CSNY2 album as that we're inventing, that has never existed, as I said. Again, sort of folky, folk picking, guitar picking, ragtimey. And it uses a sort of classic folk mode, the major scale in Anglo-Saxon countries, which is the major scale plus a flattened seventh. I particularly like the clash between the E flat chord and the D to C run in the melody, in the chorus, if you can call it a chorus. It's a sort of classic sort of suspended chord combination that can't really plan that. You just need to work out an elegant way to get in and out of it. I believe this song was written by Stephen Stills to cheer up David Crosby, who was feeling a bit sad. I can't quite remember why, but I think it might have been for good reason. I think he had a girlfriend who died in a car crash, and I don't know if it, and he was depressed about it. And I think that was the story. I don't think I've got the chronology wrong there, but anyway, so there is a sort of sweetness to it. even though it's based on a total tragedy. But sweetness of intent behind this song. So I think that makes it, again, an even more appropriate sort of band piece, really. Now, track 3, I've gone with Better Days from the Graham Nash album. Extremely simple, this track. Basically consists of a couple of vocal lines sung over and over again with sort of portentous chord changes underneath based on a descending fifth sequence, which is sort of quite well known. Can I play it? Right, and nothing especially earth-shattering about that. I was going to say mind-blowing, earth-shattering, but I think the charm comes in here with the construction of the piece. It's got this sort of quiet opening, but then this rocky swing section that comes in. And then it goes back to a quiet bit and then back to the rocky swing bit at the end. And it sort of takes you on a journey, this track. And I find it quite affecting. It also has an impossibly high vocal flourish towards the end, which is worth sticking around for. Anyway, it's the right track in the right place at the right time, this one, I think. Now, track 4, side 1, I've got Southern Man by Neil Young. Now, again, I think this is like a CSNY track. It even sounds like one because, again, I think the guys are singing backup on it, even though it's Neil's solo album. I mean, it's such a short dash, isn't it, from Neil Young's solo album to the mothership here. I think you can almost feel it, really. Actually, the whole melody here seems to have been written with the band in mind. It's a close harmony part, right? Otherwise, it doesn't make sense, the track. And that also makes me feel like it should have been a CSNY track. Plus, doesn't really fit in with the rest of the songs on Young's second solo album, right? In my view, it's a big band production as opposed to the more intimate stuff on the rest of After the Gold Rush. And perhaps that's why they did it on Four-Way Street, which is the CSNY live album, which I haven't mentioned, but which was the only other significant production of the early period from this band. So yeah, it's so right for them. It's got a political message, of course. It's an anti-racist song, and I believe that it inspired a sort of counterattack from Lynyrd Skynyrd, who thought that Young was caricaturing, or stereotyping Southerners. But yeah, this sort of political approach, again, is quite consistent with CSNY. They did quite a lot of that. And the other thing is that I wanted to mention is that After the Gold Rush is kind of existentialists as an album. It's not really a political album. So this sticks out on that album as like a sore thumb, even though I actually think it's, in a way, the best track on that album. Hence the fact that I'm recuperating it here, reclaiming it, as it were. Now, it's also a desperately powerful track, this one, I think. It's in a minor key. Again, as I said before, condemnation of racism. So, how could it not be in a minor key, in a way? It's played tight, this track, in a slow 4 rhythm, with quite muted chords. It's full band production, as I said. And then it goes into double time in the middle, for the angry, typically atonal and weird Neil Young guitar solo. And then it goes back into that at the end. So that the sort of I think the tension here between like the opening, the song part, which is kind of played in a rather sort of tense, constrained style, I think is supposed to kind of represent the kind of tense social relations in the Southern American states at that time, right? And then you got the sort of violence breaking out in the middle with the guitar solo, and then that's pushed back down again, and then it bursts out again at the end. So it's astonishingly powerful, this track, and evocative, I think. I think also if we included this on a hypothetical CSNY2, back to the mothership, I think it could provide quite a nice contrast to some of the other happier tracks, right, on that we're going to include on this album that doesn't exist. All right. track 5, side 1 is Ohio. Now, this could be a controversial inclusion, but, I mean, why not include this? This was actually a CSNY track, right? Unlike a lot of these other tracks that we're including, this has the advantage of actually being a CSNY track. And they did actually release it, of course, but as a non-album single, right? So it's not such a stretch to imagine it being on the album, I mean, it's my party, this, isn't it? I can include what I like. It's my fantasy. I can do it's my fantasy. I'm entitled to it, aren't I? But I mean, I suppose you could have said, well, it would have been nice to have a non-album single floating around anyway. But they also had a habit of including singles on albums in those days, didn't they, in the States? So, as I say, again, it's not that much of a stretch to include this. It's also another political song, right? So it's kind of a nice sort of counterpoint provides a nice counterpoint with Southern Man, right? It kind of shores up that aspect of the of the project that was CSNY. It's a political period as well, wasn't it? This, I mean, I suppose people know the story of this song. Anyone who knows anything about CSNY will know the story. The National Guard shot dead 4 student protesters against the Vietnam War. I think in Kent State University, was it, in Ohio? So, like, because generally police and army are not allowed on university campuses, are they? I don't know if that was part of the problem, part of the protest. Anyway, I mean, not just in the States, I mean, around the world, that's true. Anyway, so this is Neil Young's comment on what happened, right? Very catchy song, which helps for a protest song. So yeah, this is the dilemma of protest songs, isn't it? You have to make it catchy and quite lovable, but even though you're talking about something absolutely horrendous. Really powerful lyrics, I think. The phrasing is very powerful. Tin soldiers and Nixon's coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming, 4 dead in Ohio. Well, it doesn't quite scan. That's the only thing. But the sentiment is very poetically expressed, I think. And also, what's nice about this track, I think, is it alternates between a very funky verse and then a kind of beautiful 3-part harmony development. 3 or 4-part harmony, perhaps. I mean, they could have had all 4 of them on this, as far as I know. And that harmony development has sort of very rich minor 7th chords in it, which are fun. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. This incredibly sad song. Weird guitar lick at the beginning. People always say that Stills and Young are great electric guitarists. I mean, the whole band played guitar, didn't they? And piano as well, I think. David Crosby might have just played the guitar, don't know. I don't remember him playing piano. But anyway, Stills and Young are normally the soloists, aren't they? The lead guitarists, as it were. I think that what they are, those two, is very expressive guitarists. They're good at feel, but sometimes I think they leave something to be desired at the level of technique. I mean, the notes are sometimes completely wrong in their guitar solos, as the opening here proves. I mean, the key is D for this track, and I guess it's Neil Young hits a D sharp for some reason. I mean, I don't know why they didn't retake it, because that note's totally incongruous there. It could have been in a hurry. Protest songs tend to go off quite fast, don't they? But I think really the thing was that I suspect that they preferred it. I suspect Neil Young went, yeah, we'll leave that in. Because the fact that it's wrong actually perhaps could be seen to heighten its expressivity, its expressiveness. So that does kind of make sense. Question of taste, I suppose. I would have redone it, but, I wasn't there, was I? Now, final little side closer for side 1 is Find the Cost of Freedom, track 6. This is also a CSNY outtake, the B-side of Ohio, right? It's a sort of quiet, intimate, folky piece. Starts with a guitar iteration of a theme, a musical theme, and then it's the vocals come in and start singing it over the guitar, and then the guitar drops out and you have the vocal alone, right? So it's sort of like a baton being passed, this track, like a staging. And I like that. I think that's quite interesting. I also think it's appropriate for this to go after Ohio, because it sounds like a sad, slightly deathly coda, And the words are quite iconic in this context as well. Find the cost of freedom buried in the ground. Mother Earth will swallow you. Lay your body down, you know. It's a sort of elegy, perhaps, to the people who died at Kent State. Who knows? You know, but basically what they're saying is, you know, it's Stephen Stills, I think, this one. But what he's saying is we will remember those who fought for our freedom, you know. So it's quite beautiful sentiment, beautiful track. Very simple, but very effective. And a nice end, as I say, in that sense, to the side one that doesn't exist and that we're inventing. Okay, side 2 comes out about 21 minutes, I think. It starts, for my money, with Military Madness, the Graham Nash song, which is the opener to his solo album. It's a sort of jaunty, fast 6/8 number. In that sense, little camp, perhaps, and in that sense also little British, you know. I mean, it reminds you of all the sort of fast, jaunty 6/8 numbers done by groups like the Beatles and the Kings, right? The British bands didn't mind that sort of slightly, including a certain sort of effeminate edge to their rock and roll, I think, which was slightly more uncomfortable for the American acts. I don't know why. I mean, who knows why? You'd have to dig right into the culture to find that out. The lyric is English too, and we'll come back to that. But I was going to say he sings in that, I think it's a North Manchester accent, which he has, right? It's quite unusual for rock and roll, which is usually sung in a straight American accent. He does do that too, even in within the confines of this track, but occasionally you get that sort of Lancashire twang coming through, which is quite fun. It seems to go with the style. It's a song also, lyrically about growing up in northern England. In an upstairs room in Blackpool by the side of a northern sea, he sings, right, at the beginning. But then the main theme here is pacifistic, right? Military madness was killing my country. That's the chorus. Slightly weird, I think, perhaps that sentiment in retrospect, because, of course, you know, this isn't the place to have a philosophical discussion about this, but, you know, even though war is horrible, no doubt, there are, I'm sure, some wars that need to be fought. This is the one he's discussing, is, i.e. World War II. It's probably one of them. You know, if ever a war needed to be fought, this was probably it. You know. Anyway, let's not dwell on that for too long. It's a lovely song. You know, it's a very nice tune, I think, unfussy and elegant, like the best English pop music, and you know, like the best Graham Nash songs, if I can put it that way. Is it too English for CSNY? Both, you know, in terms of its theme and in terms of its style, musical style, possibly. But I think it's one of the great mothership songs, as it were. So I think it from the period. So I think it has to be included. Plus, that Northern English progressivism, I think was shared by all members of this band, I think, without question. So, you know, even politically, I think it kind of fits. Okay, number 2, The Lee Shore. Now, I think this is the great lost CSNY song. It's not completely lost, of course, because they did it on Four-Way Street. But, you know, here's the studio version, let's say, which was also available as I sort of on Deja-Vu Deluxe, which I was discussing earlier. This is the version I would put on this album. This is David Crosby at his absolute best, I think. It's a completely beautiful melody, completely beautifully sung. Again, elegant, charming, lovely words too about sailing, you know. I presume it's a metaphor. I don't think he's literally just talking about sailing. Although, why not? I'm sure sailing's fun. I've never done it. I've no idea why they didn't include this in the original album. Right, Deja-Vu. But, of course, I mean, it can only be because of reasons of space. He already had 2 great long songs on the album. His songs, by the way, tend to be longer than those of the others, right? Deja-Vu was supposed to be a double, as I think I mentioned earlier, but that was probably rash. But, I mean, David Crosby certainly had the tracks, even if the others didn't. You know, he had a whole side's worth of tracks, and they had to cut a couple of them out, right? This is one of them, rather sadly. Although the 2 tracks, as I say, that he did have on Deja-Vu are great as well. So, I'm repeating myself now. The ending of this track is slightly meandering, perhaps. It had been given a Latin arrangement by, the infallible Stephen Stills, I think. And he noodles over the Latin beat for quite a long time at the end before it randomly fades out. Perhaps it could have faded out a little earlier, this track. Depends on side lengths, I think. But anyway, apart from that, unimprovable. Side 2, track 3, I'm putting in I Used to Be a King by Graham Nash. I think this is one of the finest tracks on Songs for Beginners, if not the finest. I've already mentioned this is my favourite of the 4 solo records, and as I say, this is one of the high points. I think it's just the harmonic development that accompanies the tune here, which I think is great. It's not only interesting and unusual, this development, it's also ingenious, I would say. It's difficult to explain sometimes why these harmonic developments work, in conjunction with the melodic developments, and why they're so clever. It's like solving a maths problem or something, isn't it? But they do, and this is one of them. This is a completely great song, almost randomly wonderful. It's got a sort of jazzy feel, this one. It swings. It's in 6/4, right? It starts quite slow, and then again it doubles time. Right. Did I say again? I'm not that sure. Well, that's why I said that. So another one that doubles time? Yeah. Southern man, isn't it? This one doubles time from 3/4 and it goes into from 6/4 to 3/4, so it goes into a waltz basically. So again, the line goes on a relatively dramatic journey. It has this in common with Better Days, which I mentioned earlier. And presumably that fits the lyrics somehow. I'm not 100% sure how. Although the song does seem to revolve around someone saying that they finally realised that they're not going to allow their heart to be broken again. So that's perhaps a journey that one would go on, is it not? He also sings the line in ever higher positions as he goes through the track, which sort of emphasises the idea of an emotional journey, I think. He's got the highest voice of all of them, I think, Graham Nash, by the way. Side 2, track 4 is Laughing, which was the other Crosby outtake from Deja-Vu, right? I think this is, again, it's great. And I would say this time, sort of paradigmatic Crosby number we have here. It's very characteristic of his writing style, which is frequently very interesting. He seems to just take the guitar. I mentioned before that he's sort of more guitar orientated. He seems to take his guitar, tries to find rich, complex, interesting chords, and then weaves a kind of highly elegant melody around them. Right. Key examples here are Guinevere and Wooden Ships from the first album, which are beautiful tracks. Also Triad, which was a Birds outtake. And yeah, this one. And what I especially like about it is the way the chord sequence develops, always in relation to the melody, of course. I find it very satisfying here, specifically the end of the line. So they're in D. They seem to spend a lot of their time tuning their guitars down to D, at least the lowest string. But that allows them to be in D, let's say. And that gives it a sort of like warm and rich sound, which pervades this whole track. Then he goes to the dominant A and the subdominant G, and it's got that famous major third in the voice, which produces a really nice suspended chord. I've talked about this before, how important I think this is. And he does something similar on page 43, by the way, from the first Crosby and Nash album. And anyway, it's a lovely suspended chord there, and it makes the track, I think, because everything leads up to that. Well, it also makes page 43 as well. But anyway, that's not on this album because it wasn't written yet. Once again, it's a hippiest lyric, this one from our David. About the sort of it seems to be about the enigma of existence, which for him is embodied in a child's laugh. Nothing much to say on that. Fairly exemplary of the kind of hippie romanticism of the period, right? Is it compatible with the philosophy that's laid out in the final track? Let's see. The final track is Chicago by Graham Nash, right? I don't see any other feasible way for this album to end. This is the second protest song on the album that I've invented. Second protest song also about a place. I don't know if one was inspired by the other. He's done a sad song about Ohio. I'll do one about Chicago. Right. Which place are you writing about? I'm going to write about somewhere else. Okay. Anyway, but yeah, this again was based on a real case. The trial of the Chicago 8. I suppose people will know, who were accused of conspiracy to start a riot. Getting quite heavily into American period politics here, aren't we? But yeah, one of the accused was Bobby Seale, who was a Black Panther, who was tied up and gagged in the courtroom, which is pretty shocking. And that gets a reference in this song. There was a film came out about this a couple of years ago, right? If anyone's interested and hasn't seen it already, with Borat in it. This song kind of supports the Chicago 8, and what Nash is doing here is he's imploring his bandmates to join him in a benefit concert on the subject. It's rather sort of a reference to band politics, which is kind of weird, but also makes it, again, prime material for a CSNY track, Unless I suppose you could use your solo album to have a go at your former bandmates, couldn't you? But yeah, I mean, it was written with them in mind, so let's stick it on here. Why not? He says, that's the lyrics. At one point he says, don't ask Jack to help you because he'll turn the other ear, right? I've no idea who that's a reference to, and I'm curious. Is it JFK? I don't know. Someone will know. Answers on a postcard, please. Anyway, yeah, it's a brilliant little pop song, this. Again, given extra weight, perhaps because of the theme. Very simple, very straightforward, but once again very elegant, as is Graham Nash's wont. My only tiny problem with this track is the production, which is rather sparse. I think it could have been fleshed out a bit more. I think they would have fleshed it out if they'd all had their fingers in the, in the pie, as it were. But they couldn't, because this was recorded for a solo album. But it's also a closer to his solo album, Songs for Beginners. So I've put it at the end here as well. In the same way I put Stephen Stills' opener as the opener here, because I think it works best as a closer. This Graham Nash track. I would lose the coda which he added on his solo album. I think it's called We Can Change the World, which I think is a bit redundant. So anyway, let's read through all of that again, shall we? Why not? So we've got side 1. Track 1, Love the One You're With. Track 2, Do for the Others. Track 3, Better Days. Track 4, Southern Man. Track 5, Ohio. Track 6, Find the Cost of Freedom. Side 2, Track 1, Military Madness. Track 2, The Lee Shore, Side 3, I Used to Be a King. Track 4, what am I saying? Track 4, Laughing. Track 5, Chicago. Okay. You'll notice that with one exception, the Stills Young stuff is on side 1 here, and the Crosby-Nash stuff is on side 2. Don't know why that is. It wasn't intentional. Just seems to work better that way, right? And I suppose it could be an interesting point in itself. I mean, it might mean that the split between the two writing teams in the band, which was apparent at the time, was actually real. In other words, there might be a slight stylistic difference in play. How to define that? Not sure. Perhaps country rock versus psych, proto-prog space rock. Don't know. Don't know what that means. That distinction as I've drawn it. Anyway, something to think about. Or not. Okay. On my version of CSNY2, Back to the Mothership, there's a slight dearth of Stephen Stills and Neil Young tracks, perhaps in comparison to David Crosby and Graham Nash numbers. This would have been out of character for the band. As I said, I often think that Stephen Stills was seen as the leader, and Neil Young was incredibly prolific. And of course, Stills produced loads of extra tracks for Deja-Vu, as I mentioned earlier. But as I also mentioned, I don't think any of them are that great. And Neil Young sort of proffered little for Deja-Vu, apart from Helpless, which of course is a classic. And as I've said, I'm not a huge fan of After the Gold Rush. Now, this sort of balance between Crosby and Nash and Stills and Young, I think in terms of productivity would probably, or good productivity, let's say, would probably change in the next phase, when between them, Stills and Young produced lots of very high quality tracks, right? Also worth mentioning, perhaps, Graham Nash has 4 tracks, while, for instance, David Crosby has 2. But Crosby's are actually twice as long, so it kind of works out in terms of occupying album space. Nash just tends to write shorter pieces. That's just the way things are. Okay, good. En conclusion, at the beginning I was talking about why bands split up. Who knows? Who knows? There's a Woody Allen film, Hannah and Her Sisters, right? Where one of the characters, I think played by Max von Sydow, says, when he's talking about the question as to why the Holocaust happened, he said, documentalists often ask why, how could this possibly, or historians often ask how could this have possibly happened, the Holocaust. But Sidov's character said, well, the real question is, why doesn't it happen more often? Mutatis mutandis, perhaps a better question than why bands split up is how they managed to get together in the first place, especially given their personalities, which often seem to be quite, hard work. In any case, I think that's an end to our thought experiment. We now know beyond a shadow of a doubt what a CSNY follow-up would have looked like, I'm sure. I even think you could extend the exercise and extrapolate a CSNY3, perhaps, incorporating the first Crosby and Nash album, which has a few really good tracks, but also, crucially, as I said before, the twin masterpieces, Manassas by Stephen Stills, and Harvest by Neil Young, But that's for another day. And as I say, you can't stop these bands bloody well splitting up, can you? So, I hope that's been somewhat illuminating. And we'll see you next week on the next episode of the Classic Rock and Prog Almanac, which I think will be with myself and Sean. But to be confirmed. And I hope you have a good day, or whatever is coming up next for you. Okay, see you later. Ta-ra.